We're in this series called Go and Be, where we're celebrating the work as God is doing all throughout the world through our church partners and thinking about how we too can go and be love unlimited wherever we are. That's our vision as a church, after all. You hear it every Sunday morning. Third city is, oh, come on now. You guys know better than that. Third city is, thank you. What a vision. It's one of the things that first attracted me to this church, but it's also pretty abstract, isn't it? I mean, is there really no limit to our love? A few nights ago, I was putting our boys to bed, and I have a whole routine I go through with them every night, at least when I haven't lost it, trying to get them to brush their teeth. We say the Lord's Prayer in their beds. I tell them how much I love them, how glad I am that I get to be their dad. But this one night, I decided to mix it up. I said to my 5-year-old Scotty, why don't you tell your older brother how much you love him? Well, Scotty thought that was the funniest idea in the world. He was like, what? Hayden doesn't love me. And he just laughed and laughed and laughed. I said, that's not true. Hayden, you love Scotty, don't you? Well, Hayden, who happens to be the loudest, most animated kid in the world that I know, could not have been less convincing. Here were his direct words. Yeah. I thought, come on, Hayden, help a dad out. But I could see this was going nowhere, and so I left it at that. I wasn't going to force it. I knew that deep down these guys really did love each other, and maybe someday they'll express it in their words. But for them, love is a word that's just reserved for things like mom, dad, Minecraft, and anything with frosting on top. That's about it. That's the extent of their love. And if we're honest with ourselves, don't we tend to reserve our love too? Like, we like the idea of love unlimited, but are we really supposed to love everyone? There's a phrase we often use for this. It's, yeah, but. Like, yeah, I know I should be love unlimited, but what about to that loud eater at the office that I can always hear munching 3 doors down? It's the worst, right? Am I really supposed to love them? Or, yeah, I know I should be love unlimited, but what about to the guy who one-ups all of my stories at small group? Doesn't he get enough love for himself? Or, yeah, I know I should be love unlimited, but what about to that Facebook friend I met just once 10 years ago who posts all the crazy political stuff? Am I really supposed to love them? We all have yeah, but people in our lives. But what does Jesus have to say about yeah, but people? Are there really no limits to whom we should love? Well, to answer that question, we're going to be looking at this story we're looking throughout this whole series. It's in Luke 10:25, and so if you have a Bible with you, you can turn there. If your phone is your Bible, you can just Google it, and it'll pop right up. It's pretty great, and if not, we're going to have all the words on the screen. And the story goes like this. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Now, that's a good question. It's a question we all ought to ask at some point in our life. How do I get a spot in the age to come when God will once and for all restore our broken and fractured world? Well, Jesus responds, as he often does, with a question. He says in verse 26, what is written in the law? He replied, how do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this, and you will live. So Jesus agrees with the man. If you love God with everything you've got and then some, and if you're willing to love your neighbor as yourself, in other words, to the same degree as you love yourself, if you love other people and want the best for them, just like you would want the best for yourself, you can be sure of this. You're going to have eternal life. But, as the story goes on, he wanted to justify himself. And so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? All right, let's pause here. So the guy asks Jesus a follow-up question, and it sounds innocent enough. He's a lawyer, right? Sounds like he's just interested in the fine print. He wants to know, what does the fine print have to say? But Luke lets us in on his real motives. It says he wanted to justify himself. What does the word justify mean? It means to show you're in the right, to put yourself in the clear. It means you've done or said things that might make you guilty of breaking this law, depending on how you interpret it. It means this guy, just like us, probably had a history of saying, yeah, but, about people. Like, yeah, I know I should love my neighbor, but what if they're a lawbreaker? What if they're not kosher? What if they eat bacon for breakfast? We should just go ahead and excommunicate them, right? The guy wants to know if there's any loopholes to this whole love thing. And so Jesus answers his question with a story. Picking up in verse 30, he says, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." And Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." Now, normally when this story is taught, the takeaway, at least as I have usually heard it, is that we should be the type of people who are willing to go and help out anybody we meet in need along the road. And that's good. We should be the type of people who step in and help whenever we see people who are helpless and hurting. And in fact, we're actually going to talk about this next week, this idea that we all have time, talents, and resources that we can share to help out other people. But at the same time, there's a whole other layer to this story where Jesus just blows apart all of this lawyer's notions about what constitutes a neighbor. And so let's walk this back. Look again at how the parable begins. Jesus says in verse 30, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho." So let's pause here. So the road Jesus is describing is a real road. You can go walk on it today. Now, I wouldn't recommend it. It's 17 miles long, and it's super steep. And not only that, but it's also in the wilderness. It goes right through the Judean wilderness. It's kind of a nowheresville. It's a perfect place for robbers to ambush you. And in fact, it was known for this. One of its modern names is Talat Adum, which means road of blood, a scent of blood. And it has this name because of all the people who have been beaten and bloodied on this road over the years. So this is the setting for the parable. And on this road, a man is attacked by robbers. Now, we don't know a whole lot about this guy, but one thing we can assume is that he was Jewish. In fact, the New Living Translation goes ahead and says this for us. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him dead beside the road. And then what happens? Verse 31. A priest happened to be going down the same road. The word translated there as happened is a word that means luck. Basically, it's saying this is a lucky guy. Why is this guy who's been robbed lucky? Well, what's a priest? Basically, it was a Jewish religious leader. Think Dan Walter with a big hat and a fancy robe. In fact, do we have, okay, yeah, there you go. An authentic first century Jewish priest. This here is why the man was lucky. If anybody would go and be help to the man, surely it would be that guy. But what does Dan do? What does the priest do? Verse 31. he passed by on the other side. Not so lucky. But let's read on, verse 32. So too a Levite came to the place and saw him. Let's pause here again. What's a Levite? Basically, it was a temple assistant, someone who is like a high-level church volunteer around here on Sunday mornings. If you see anybody here on Sunday mornings that look like they're on staff, if you didn't know better, that's what we're talking about. Now, I'm not going to do to any of our volunteers what I did to Dan, and so here we've got a nice picture of Parker Lowry in a linen tunic. I'm not sure if that's supposed to be a Levite or Jesus, but we're going to say Levite. Now, what does the Levite do? Not Parker, because we know that Parker would get the whole life story of this guy, but what does the Levite do? It says he passed by on the other side. So two people you'd expect would stop. Two people who, by the way, were coming from Jerusalem to Jericho, which means they were coming from work, coming from the temple, coming from their version of church. Think about that. They were leaving church and didn't go and be help to the man in need. But then plot twist, verse 33. A Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. Let's pause here again. Let's talk about the Samaritan. Over the centuries, the term Samaritan has gotten a lot of great PR. There's all sorts of charitable organizations called Samaritan. There's a hospital in Kearney called Good Samaritan. This parable is called the parable of the Good Samaritan. In our world, to be called a Samaritan is to be considered good. But we shouldn't miss the fact that in first century Jewish society, Samaritans were thought of as anything but good. Samaritans were non-Jews. They had different beliefs than Jews. They lived right in the center of Jewish territory. In fact, their area roughly overlapped with that of the modern West Bank. And truth is, how Jews felt about Samaritans back then is probably not so different from how many Israelis today feel about Palestinians in the West Bank. Certainly, it's not so different from how many Israelis feel about Hamas. And so Jews tried to avoid Samaritans at all costs. In fact, the reason why many Jews walked this road from Jerusalem to Jericho was specifically so they could avoid Samaritans. If you look at this map again, notice this. If you wanted to go from Jerusalem to Galilee, where a lot of Jews lived up north, this is where Jesus grew up. If you wanted to go from Jerusalem to Galilee, the fastest way to do it would be to go straight through Samaria. But what did most Jews do? They traveled this road from Jerusalem to Jericho and then up north, just so they could avoid Samaria. Think about that. They'd rather walk a steep, treacherous, robber-friendly road of blood than come in contact with a Samaritan. And so imagine then how shocking, how scandalous, how upside down it must have seemed when Jesus made a Samaritan, of all people, the neighbor in the story. What was Jesus' point in doing this? It wasn't simply to teach that we should help those we meet in need, although that is true. It was to blow up all of this lawyer's assumptions about who could be his neighbor. It was to teach that even a despised Samaritan could be his neighbor. And if a Samaritan could be his neighbor, then any person from any background, birthplace, or belief system could be his neighbor. And the same goes for us. It means there is no place in our lives for yeah-butting people. Whether it's the person in the office, the homeless guy at Walmart, the refugee across town, or the family starving from famine in a war zone overseas. Jesus doesn't teach us to prioritize our family, our clan, and country first, and only then to love outsiders. No, in effect, Jesus teaches us, right here in this story, that we are to love everyone always. I remember one time this hit home for me. I say this because truth is, this has hit home many times. I've had a lot of lessons to learn about this, and I probably have many more lessons and blind spots to learn about how I say yeah, but about other people. But back in 2020, after the death of George Floyd and the aftermath of that event, when I was still at a previous church, we felt like we really needed to learn and understand what role we have in all of this. This was a diverse church in the northern suburbs of Chicago, and as forward as Chicago is, at least presents itself to be, it remains one of the most segregated cities in our country. And so we knew if our body of believers had any hope of being a light in our community and looking like the church described in Revelation 7:9, where people of all nations, ethnicities, and languages worship together as one, then we had to address the issue head on. And so for a period of 10 weeks, I moderated a discussion of a study called The Color of Compromise. This is a study that traces the history of racism in the American church from the colonial times to the present day. And as I say that, I have to imagine that in a church our size, that probably stirs up a lot of feelings. I want to assure you that some of those feelings were also felt when Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan. Racism is not an easy thing to talk about. It's hard. And this was hard. It was a humbling experience. It was a very complicated experience. I was moderating this discussion on Zoom for over 100 people. And yet I also have to tell you that it was one of the most beautiful, unifying, and transformative ministry experiences I've ever gotten to be a part of as I witnessed people share with one another, confess to one another, say, I'm sorry. Just imagine that, saying, I'm sorry to one another, praying for one another. I saw a good Samaritan kind of love emerge in that community, and I thank God that I got to be a part of it. And my hope for us at Third City is that we'd be known for having a similar barrier-breaking quality of love. So how do we do that? Well, first off, if we're to love our neighbors, all of our neighbors, then we first need to learn about our neighbors. It's hard to love people you don't know anything about, and so this starts with us just simply putting ourselves in places where we're with people who are different than us and think differently than us. One great way you can do this, go on one of our global serving trips. There are few ways to learn more about the world than simply going to another part of the world and being among the people, especially among people who are hurting. It'll open your eyes. I know it has for me every time I've had one of these experiences. Second, we've got to learn to care for those who are different than us. And this isn't just a switch you can flip. Compassion doesn't just turn on like a light bulb. No, you've got to cultivate it. And I found in my own experience one of the best ways I can learn to care for other people more, especially people who have a hard time just naturally loving, is to begin praying for them. I found that if I have someone that but I know I need to love, if I pray for them every single day, slowly over time, my ideas and thoughts about this person begin to change. I begin to want the best for that person. So we need to learn about people. We need to learn to care for people. And then third and finally, we've just got to put our love into action. Brenden Manning once wrote, the greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips and walk out the door and deny him by their lifestyle. I don't want to face Jesus one day and hear that I was a Christian who lived a certain way and led other people away from following Jesus. And my guess is you don't either. And so Third City, let's go and be love unlimited, truly unlimited. It's what Jesus did for us, and it's what we're called to go and be for the world.
A few months ago, I had an opportunity to visit with some of our partners in Southeast Asia who are working in a part of the world where it's hostile to Christianity. And to become a Christian means that you risk losing everything. Just walking around, you could feel the heaviness of a life without Jesus. Right now, 42% of the world's population lives in what we call an unreached people group, which means almost half of our world has little to no access to the gospel. And what's more staggering is that just 3% of missions work goes to unreached people groups. And as I sat with our partners, I began to understand why. Because this is very hard work. It's lonely work. Every time you meet up to pray or share the gospel with someone, you risk the authorities finding out and coming and bringing you to prison. Most of our partners have experienced that type of persecution. And yet, God is opening up the door in ways that we have not seen. Right now, Muslims are coming to put their faith in Jesus at a faster rate than ever before. Jesus is making a way, and that's what our partners are saying. Jesus is doing something. He's doing the work. He's showing up in visions and dreams, things that us Americans sometimes just seems weird to us, right? He's leaving the 99 to find the one. And I wanted to share just one story with you today. This is the story of Nassim. Nassim picked us up from the airport, and he really is this story of Jesus kicking down the walls to find the one. He and his family welcomed us into their home, fed us the most amazing meal I have ever had in my entire life. Nassim's online right now, I'm pretty sure. Inshallah, and the kids, hi friends, we love you. We're grateful for you. They are refugees that live in Southeast Asia. About a year ago, if you were here when Scott had us raise up a light and let a group of people who were being persecuted know that we were praying for them, that was this family. And we've been praying for them every day since. They are a part of our church family. They're part of our church family. They just live in a different part of the world. And we wanted to take an opportunity to share Nassim's story with you. He graciously allowed us to capture this. And so if you have your reading glasses, you might want to pull them out because there's going to be subtitles. You can read this. Nassim's in a part of the world that it's safe for him to share his story, unlike some of our other partners. And so that's why he's sharing that with us today.
سلام، من نسیم عموری، اهل ایرانم، متولد شهر آبادان. من داخل یه خانواده کاملا مسلمان به دنیا آمدم که آشنا شدم با خانمم و یه عشق و محبتی بین من و او به وجود اومد و همین سبب ازدواج من و او شد. اینجوری آغاز شد که قبل از من او ایمان آورده بود به مسیح. اومدیم به اندونزی به خاطر که خانمم ایمان آورده بود فرار کردیم، اومدیم اندونزی که از اندونزی سوار قایق بشیم و بریم به استرالیا. $8,000 پول دادم به دست قاچاقبرمون که ما رو ببره، ولی خب متاسفانه همچین چیزی اتفاق نیفتاد. پولمو خواستم ولی پولی به من نداد تا اونجایی شد که من اومدم لاپورتشو دادم به اینترپول استرالیا. قاچاقبرمون رو دستگیر کردم، به منم گفتن که تو هم بیا به عنوان شاهد. 1 ماه بیشتر نبود که داخل اندونزی بودم و زبان اندونزی رو بلد نبودم. اینجا شد که من امضا کردم و همین امضا سبب این شد که من وارد زندان بشم. تا اومدم یه خورده سر صدا کردم، من رو به تکم زدن، انداختنم داخل یه اتاق خیلی کوچیک. من نمیدونستم واقعا جرم من چیه، برای چی من آوردن. اونا رو از یک شهر دیگه که بود بردن یک شهر دیگه که حدود 4.5 ساعت با هواپیما فاصله داشت با ما. 2 ماه زندانی بودن تا جایی رسیده بود که خانم من کف او زندانو میشست به خاطر اینکه فقط غذا بدم به بچه‌ام. بهش میگفتم این به خاطر ایمانی که آوردی به عیسی مسیح ما رو بدبخت کردی، ما رو بیچاره کردی، بچه‌امو بدبخت کردی، الان چی کار بکنیم؟ و او هر روز به من بشارت مسیح رو میداد. 5 سال و 2 ماه برای من حکم بریدن، ولی خب من بیگناه بودم. اینجا بود که همسرم شهلا خبر رو شنید، خیلی سختی کشید. داخل یک کمپی بود که سومالیا بودن و اونا فهمیده بودن که شهلا و بچه‌ها از اسلام اومدن به مسیحیت. خیلی اذیتشون کردم. میگفتن شما نجسین، شما مرتدین، شما کافرین. خیلی زجر کشیدن، خیلی درد کشیدن. وقتی که شهلا خبر زندانی منو 5 سال و 2 ماه شنید، بیمار شد و جوری شد که فقط تشنج میکرد. فهمیدن که چند تا رگ داخل سرش بسته شده و خونی جاری نمیشه. اینجا بود که من هر روز پیش خدا دعا میکردم. ای خدا، ای الله، ای خدا. دعا میکردم، قرآن میخوندم، ولی هیچ جوابی من نشنیدم. پاستورای کلیسای شهلا به من گفتن که امشب فکر میکنم شب آخر باشه و دیگه شاید نتونی با شهلا صحبت بکنی یا شهلا بین ما باشه. و دکترها همه ناامید شده بودن ازش. خواب دیدم. سالن خیلی بزرگی بود و دیواراش همه سفید بود. یه میزی اون وسط بود و یه نفر خوابیده بود. من اومدم بالای سرش. من فهمیدم که این کیه. بهش گفتم که تو همون خدایی که شهلا میگه زنده ای، تو چجوری زنده ای ولی تو مردی؟ او از تو چجوری میخواسته؟ چی رو از تو میخواست؟ تو یه دروغگویی، تو دروغ گفتی به او. تو همین حرفا بود که دیدم نشست. من از داخل، از درون ترسیدم که آره یه مرده الان بلند شد نشست، ولی داخل چشمام ترس نبود و من داشتم بهش میگفتم. گفت چی میخوای؟ گفتم که من چی میخوام؟ شهلا میگه که پدر آسمانی ما پدر ماست. چجوری میشه یه پدر بخوابه ولی بچهش مریض باشه؟ گفتش که تو چی میخوای؟ گفتم تو اگه واقعا خداوندی، تو اگر واقعا عیسی مسیحی، من از تو میخوام که شهلا رو خوب کنی. گفت که برو. همینو میخوای؟ گفتم بله. من از خواب پرید. ساعت 8 صبح بود. دیدم تلفنم زنگ میخوره. تلفن رو جواب دادم، دیدم خود شهلاست. گفتم تو خودتی؟ در صورتی که حدود 2 ماه که ایشون داخل بستر بیماری بودن تو کما بود. اصلا حرف نمیزدیم، نمیتونستیم حرف بزنیم با هم دیگه. صداشو که شنیدم دگرگون شدم، ولی بازم یادم نیفتاد بود به مسیح. بازم نمیدونستم که چیه. به او گفتم که چی شد؟ بهم گفتش که من یه حسی اومد به من، یه حس و حالی اومد داخل وجودم و به من گفت که بلند شو و بلند شدم و الان حالم خوبه. یه چند ساعت بعد از اینکه جواب آوردن گفتن که هیچ مشکلی نداری. دکترها همه تعجب کرده بودن، یعنی تمام مردم اونجا شاهد بودن یه همچین چیزی رو، شهادت میدادن که بله این دیگه تموم شده بود. من یهویی یادم افتاد، گفتم این خوابی بود که من دیدم. داخل کتاب نوئل هست 2:28 که میگه من با خواب و رویا میام به سراغ شما. او خوب شد. همون موقع تا من فهمیدم که خوب شد، من گفتم پس خدای واقعی عیسی مسیح. همون موقع من ایمان آوردم به عیسی مسیح. کتاب قرآنمو دادم، سجاده نمازمو دادم. من از زندان اومدم بیرون و شروع کردم به بشارت دادن خبر خوش عیسی مسیح و خوشحالم از این که مسیحی شدم. زندگیم تغییر کرده. خداوند از من استفاده کرده برای بشارت دادن توی زندان‌ها، چون من میدونم داخل زندان‌ها چقدر سختی هست، دوری از خانواده، مریضی‌ها، همه چیزها رو خیلی خوب میدونم و این من فکر میکنم این بهترین موقعیته که خداوند از من استفاده میکنه و من میتونم بشارت مسیح رو داخل زندان‌ها به اونایی که امید ندارن، به اونایی که خیلی سخته براشون زندگی، من بهشون بشارت بدم، من بتونم بهشون امید بدم و مطمئنم که خداوند به خاطر این بوده که منو گذاشته داخل زندان و من همیشه میگم این لطف خداوند بود که منو آورد توی زندان و من زندانی شدم و شاید من اگر زندانی نمی شدم هیچ وقت به عیسی مسیح ایمان نمی آوردم.
Nasim, thank you for sharing your story. Jesus is moving, and this is his story. It always has been, it always will be. And he is inviting us in because he loves his kids, all of them, all of his kids. And what Nassim didn't share is the cost of following Jesus and what this has meant for him and his family. I asked him, are you ever tempted to go home? Or do you ever miss home? And he said, yeah, every day. But how could I lie about what Jesus has done in my life? And so God is using Nassim and Shala and their family in the midst of unbelievably difficult circumstances to reach people for him. I've seen it. He uses them every single day. And today, as you leave, you're going to receive a keychain that looks like this. This was made by one of our partners who is risking everything to reach the lost. On the keychain is a note about the organization who put this together, and we're going to ask that you don't post anything about them or look them up and write anything on their story or anything publicly, because we don't want to put them at any risk, because the authorities are watching them. And, I was talking with one of our partners. She said, we would take 1,000 prayers any day over $1,000, because we know that this battle will not be won with money. God is the one who's moving. It's his story. In fact, they took 2 years and just stopped everything they were doing to pray. And they're seeing God open door after door after door. And that is the story that we're a part of. This month is Ramadan, where millions and millions of Muslims are seeking God in prayer. Third City, let's pray that they would find Jesus as they seek God. Jesus is moving, and he is inviting us into his work. The question is, are we available? Are we willing to be interrupted?